Mudflood is stupid, and also kind of right, but not in the way they think. Hi, I'm Matt Finish, and you're watching New Age Snake Oil, the show where I take a deep dive into some nonsense I found on the internet and see if there's any truth hidden under all that Tik Tok bullshit. This one's a little different because it straddles into conspiracy more than I typically like to go, but my TikTok algorithm is so destroyed from this channel that I keep seeing this nonsense, and I need to talk about it.
Mudflood theory goes like this. Long ago in Eastern Eurasia, there was an ancient society called Tartaria. It was a sprawling empire that lived in harmony with nature and with its citizens. They were super advanced and practiced peace and love. They built buildings all over the world, and everyone was happy until a great cataclysm killed them all, burying them in mud, leaving the only proof of their existence being old maps and half-buried buildings. Buildings which, according to the theory, new civilizations found and occupied.
Mudflood is fascinating. It's surprisingly modern, and its advocates use so little evidence, I'm not fully convinced that people actually believe this. According to my comments section, though, they definitely do, and think I'm an idiot.
Welcome to the board. Here I have elbow pads and a microphone, so you know it's serious. The way I see it, there are three pillars that hold up the whole Mudflood conspiracy, and if we can disprove or discredit them, the whole thing falls apart. First, did Tartaria as an empire exist? Pretty straightforward. Number two, was there a great catastrophic mudflood that consumed most of the world? And number three, are our American classic buildings actually ancient buildings that have been buried and then rediscovered in a grand conspiracy so that the populace does not discover there was a secret empire that was consumed by the Mudflood? Yeah, that one's not as straightforward.
Tartaria as an empire did not exist. Point blank, I'm saying it, come at me. The only people who are going to tell you this empire existed are either lying to you or are believing people who are lying to them. And I hear you in the comments, but Matt, what about all the evidence? What evidence? The only thing these people have to point to is old maps and flags. And yes, I understand that a country would have maps and flags, but stay with me. These maps are not showing what these people think they are. They're gonna look at old maps like this one, or maybe even this one if I have the room above my head. And they're gonna say, look, there is that big chunk of land cut out that is clearly Tartaria. We have to understand that these maps are not showing an area of land populated by a unified people, like China or France, countries. They're showing a general geographic location, much like we might do with Antarctica. Great example. Thank you, Matt. A good example of this phenomenon would be Appalachia. Is it Appalachia or Appalachia? Appalachia. It's not a single area, and yes, there is a mountain range, but the area itself is not just defined by the mountain range itself. It's kind of just a general geographic range that we call Appalachia. It's not a unified people, it's not a unified culture, and it's not even a country because the country it's in is the United States. Very similar to what's happening here. And let's not forget the whiteness of it all. These maps are made by Western Europeans who don't really know anything about that area, which begs the question, why are all the maps and flags we see coming out of Western Europe? Why are we not seeing any sources from Turkey or China? Two nations that love to write shit down. We're not talking about two smaller tribal states with no written language. Turkey and China have been keeping really good records for a long time. China is one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, and they take meticulous records about the goings-ons of various empires and nations. We have records from 429 AD showing that China knew about the existence of Rome and Egypt. But they have no mention of Tartary, the legendary civilization that allegedly built the Great Wall of China to keep the Chinese out.
Was the Great Wall of China built to keep the Chinese out?
No. I put a lot more stock in some Western Europeans just making some shit up than I do China just saying, we've written enough things down. Forget that superpower just to the north of us. I'm sure that won't come up later. Okay, and what about the flags? I am embarrassed to say how deep I dug on these damn flags. There is only 2 flags you will see. It's these right here. I was sure that I was gonna find some smoking gun of like a forged book or some medieval manuscript that claimed to be much older, something like that. Turns out it's way simpler. They're just flags for another country. These flags are originally credited to the Khanate of Kazan, a medieval Turkish Tartar state that existed around the 1500s. There was also some mention of some naval flags that I found, but the links to those were dead, and also, the nation was supposed to be landlocked anyway, so it'd be pretty weird if they had a massive navy fleet. So is this another grand conspiracy, a country that got made up just to cover another country up? No. Someone copied the flag of the Khanate of Kazan incorrectly into a book. They were told that Tartars lived there, Turkish Tartars, and so they labeled it Tartary. Cool. That got copied over and over and over again until now, 100 years later, there's an atlas claiming a place existed that didn't. And I want to be very clear, no atlas says there is a grand empire of Tartary. I am saying a book shows this flag, and some people claim that that means Tartary is a magic empire. It's not. I know that that is a really convenient answer for the question I am posing, but we need to remember this stuff happens all the time. We have examples in map errors like these, where, look, California is a fucking island, and then we have these flag errors from an atlas in 1905, which people on the internet pointed out, that's not South Africa's flag. And that was in the 1900s. I can already hear the clacking of your keyboards, typing into my comment section, Matt, you didn't disprove anything. It's literally impossible for me to prove something didn't exist. It is up to you, not you, lovely viewer, but you, theoretical Mudflood theorist, who is trying to come into my video to troll my comments. It is up to you to prove Tartaria exists. With the evidence I have seen, I think I have debunked all of it. If you have more evidence that you want to send it my way, please do, and I'll disprove that too. So the actual Mudflood part of this theory is pretty straightforward. Basically, all the evidence is just half-buried buildings or sections of buildings that are exposed during construction that people say look like they were buried in mud and are ancient. And it's pretty easy to find if you just spend 5 minutes looking. This is the US Capitol building when it was under construction. People saw the columns down at the base, if you can see under that staircase, and said, well, that's clearly an old entryway to some ancient building. They're not. They're support columns. They're literally holding up the staircase. You can go on tours to explore the crypts of the Capitol. It's super cool and interesting. It's not Mudflood. This church is actually the image that got me started on all of this. This church is really interesting. It was built, and then 20 years later, the road outside was leveled, so it had to build a first floor, basically, underneath the now second floor. Mudflood people say this proves that it existed beforehand. It doesn't. There are literally photos on the church's website showing you this angle, where you can see this section right here. You can see that there is no building underneath the first floor. It doesn't exist yet. It's going to be built. Which is, once again, super cool. Building a first floor after you've built the second floor is not typically how you build buildings, but it's not Mudflood. Then we have this image from Paris, which is from the central station of the subway. Very similar to the first image. People saw these columns in photographs and said, that's an ancient structure. It's not. It's a building technique called underpinning, which is used to support more weight. I'm not an architect or a civil engineer. I don't know how it works, but architects told me that's what it is, so I'm gonna believe them because I believe experts. There's really just no evidence of a mud flood. I'm sorry, there isn't. I can go through more and more of these images if you really want me to, but honestly, it's gonna just feel like more of the same. If you have evidence of the mud flood that you want to drop in my comments, please do so. I promise you I will look at it and give you my thoughts on it. That's all I can do. We're moving on. This is the section I was super excited about. So the theory here is that all of our filigreed and decored buildings from, the 1700s and that time period are actually ancient buildings that we discovered and then occupied. And I love this section because it is so easy to debunk. Like, stupid easy. Getting specific here, for some reason these theorists love the World's Fair. They are convinced that every World's Fair in America was just an excuse to host an event at these ancient buildings, pretend they were modern, so that you could then knock them down afterward. And the main crux of their argument here is that you couldn't build these buildings fast enough. And that's pretty much it. Except here's the problem. We have photos of these buildings being built. Wha-bam! What-cha-bam! I don't think I need to say more on that because photo evidence. What more do you want? So if we get more general now, zooming out, the whole theory kind of revolves around the shift from Neo-Grecian architecture into a more modern, which they would call brutalist architecture. I don't actually think it's brutalist. I think of like Soviet Russia for brutalism, but whatever. It's not important. This isn't a show about archaeology. Architecture. These theories point to domes and arches all over the world of examples of Tartarian architecture wiped out by an expanding Western force. What they don't realize is that these buildings that they hold in such high esteem are the exact opposite. These buildings are the physical testament of Western European colonialism. They were not placed there by some secret lost empire. They were deliberately put there by several very well-known empires. Empires that were trying to squash the culture that originally belonged to these regions. And these buildings were one of the tools used to do that. These buildings are the evidence of European expansion, not something that needs to be protected from it. They framed the Western Europeans somehow as the villains, but not the villains who did the actual villainous thing. It is some weird fucking mental gymnastics. These are all examples of quote-unquote Tartarian architecture, and it's just imperialism. Rio de Janeiro, Hong Kong, South Africa, Australia. There was a widespread destruction of traditional architecture in favor of an expanding empire. That's what these theorists get right. But what they don't seem to understand is that the very buildings they hold up as examples of this culture are actually artifacts of the destruction of previous cultures. They don't understand that these buildings are part of the spread of a new empire, not examples of culture that need to be protected from it. I feel for these theorists. I really do. Not with all the lost civilization nonsense. I think that's bullshit. But what they are coming to terms with is that modern architecture makes them feel bad. And I agree. Look, who wants to walk around massive towers of glass and steel when you can walk around beautiful arches with gorgeous columns, thick and hard and right up in your face? Yeah, I said it. Current architecture alienates people. It makes us feel distant from each other. It removes spaces for us to gather in that are not work or home. So I get where these people are coming from. And it feels right to say that we as a society have lost something when it comes to building beautiful spaces. But that statement is just too black and white. There is a lot of politics that went into why our architecture looks the way it does, and a lot of it actually came from trying to take the power of buildings out of the hands of people with money. It didn't work, but it was an attempt. At the end of the day, these theorists who say, well, Americans in the 1760s couldn't have built that, or we don't even know how to do that now, don't understand the evolution of modern building practices. They don't understand that there is a style of masonry that just doesn't really exist in the US anymore, but it was very prominent for a long period of time. There was a time when governments would spend money to build fancy fucking post office like this. It is important to note that this post office does not serve a single area, but is rather a regional hub, and it makes a lot of sense for it to be very fancy. I see you in the comments, shut the fuck up. All right, y'all, that's it. I think I have debunked this. If you disagree, get in the comments. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know if there are any theories you would like me to cover, to talk about. I would love to know what interests you. All right, like and subscribe, baby, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.